I'm John Wilker, the organizer of 360 IDEP. I hope you enjoy this session recording, but first I wanted to mention one thing. We've served the community since 2009, and over the past few years we've had to take on debt in an effort to keep the conference alive. After several unforeseen challenges, not the least of which is a pandemic of indefinite duration, we've had to make the hard choice to end the conference as we're now facing over $100,000 in debt. As a result of requests from the community of how they can help, we've created a GoFundMe campaign. If you're inclined and able, please consider donating to help keep 360 IDEP going. The QR code after this will link you to the campaign. Thank you. Enjoy the recording.
What data type of everything that you're using. So if you have a basic expense tracking application, you have description, you have expense amount, and you know what the data type of those are. And that is what our schema is. It is table-based, and SQL, or you'll find a lot of memes about it, but SQL is called structured query language. And what that means is this is the language for how we are actually fetching data out of our database and writing data to the database. You'll use a language called SQL, but there's a lot of different flavors of it as well. We also have non-relational databases, or NoSQL. So these are schema-less So everything I just told you, kind of forget what just happened. NoSQL databases store data in different ways, like a graph, a wide column, document, key value, and I believe there might be one more, but those are the general basis of you're just storing your data in a different way. So when you think about it, when you're not 100% sure what your data may look like, you can use NoSQL databases and start organizing it right now, and then later add on as you keep going. So our question is to use SQL or to not use SQL. And you have to, again, think about your data structure. When you have a general idea of what you know it's gonna be, you can use SQL. Or when you already have that backend database knowledge, you may want to go with SQL, or you may want to go with NoSQL if you're more familiar with that side. So it's really all about how do you want to structure a database, but like we said, or like Justin said at the very beginning of this conference, code is ephemeral. It's not really gonna matter what you actually use in the end because it's most likely going to change in the next couple years. And then lastly, is scalability. So for indie devs, it kind of doesn't matter as much unless like you're about to build an app that you know is about to have like 20,000, 100,000 users immediately. You most likely probably don't need to worry about scalability. But when you see this, horizontal scaling is we have a server, we add a couple servers to our database. That's it, that's horizontal. Vertical is we have one server and we keep adding specs onto that server. So say we add more CPU, more RAM, that would be more like vertical scaling. So we are making an indie app, but what database do we use? For this talk, we are going to be focusing solely on Firebase, AWS Amplify, and Vapor with Postgres. But I've looked at my presentation and I was like, I actually talk about all the databases you can use with Vapor, not just Postgres. So first off, Firebase. It is a database made by Google, if you didn't know, but it's not just a database, it's actually a bunch of different services that they have. So I just call it the Firebase umbrella because it has a bunch of different things like remote config, Crashlytics, cloud messaging, and literally a ton of other things. But with their database, they use what they call Firestore and the real-time database, and those are both NoSQL databases. AWS Amplify is made by Amazon, if you didn't know, and it also has its own umbrella, but it's like a gigantic umbrella because AWS covers a bunch of different things. So I couldn't name all of them, I just looked it up and I was like, API Gateway, AppSync, Device Farm. I don't know what any of those do, but they are part of AWS. And they use what is called the DynamoDB, which is another NoSQL database, and it's actually their proprietary format of that kind of a database. And then lastly, we have Vapor and PostgreSQL. And Vapor is an HTTP framework written in Swift, and you can use a bunch of different databases with it. So you would write your own API with Vapor as opposed to using the built-in one like with Firebase and Amplify. And with Vapor, I put Postgres, but yeah, you can use it with all of these different databases. So you have Postgres, SQLite, MySQL, and MongoDB. So you can even use like SQL and NoSQL databases when using Postgres. Okay, the first question is always, how do I choose the right database? And if you ask every developer here, I guarantee it, they will start the sentence off with it depends. So what does it depend on? For this, we're gonna consider things like pricing, what kind of data we want to use, and then authentication. So first off, our Firebase pricing. There is no cost and pay-as-you-go, and pay-as-you-go is called a Blaze plan. And what it depends on for your pricing, like thresholds, are your amount of data that you're storing, and that's in gigabytes, and reads, writes, and deletes. So depending on how much you're reading, writing, and deleting to your database per month, that has an API limit, and you can only hit a certain limit until basically you'll start getting errors and it won't work if you're on the free plan, or if you're on pay-as-you-go, it will continue to work and you will be charged. But you also have 10K verified users, which I found out during the Stump thing last night. The web page is actually different on Firebase Mobile, like on their website versus on the desktop application or desktop website. And you have 10K verified, meaning it's verified or you're verifying your user's phone number versus you actually have 50,000 monthly active users. So you can hit up to 50K people that are using your application, but if you verify them, it's only 10K. And that's also only based in some countries, and you would have to look at their website to know which ones. Next, we have AWS Amplify. Their pricing follows very similar patterns. They depend on the service that you use, and they explicitly state it in that way, versus Firebase. You see the Firebase website and see all the different things you can use immediately with it, whereas Amplify, you can use almost all the different Amazon services that are offered, but to find the pricing, you have to go to the individual ones. So we have Amazon S3, which is used for storage, and then again, they have reads, writes, and deletes, number of active users. But it was hard to find it in like a very cohesive way like Firebase. So for that, they have a website called calculator.aws, and you can pick and choose which services you want to use, and based on that, they'll give you an invoice of what an estimated cost could look like. And lastly, we have Vapor. So you don't pay for Vapor. You pay for where you're actually going to host your Vapor API. So for this, I decided to host it on Heroku because it's one of the easiest solutions, and they have a free, Production Pro, and Enterprise plan. But as of literally August 25th, 6 days ago, that has changed, and we no longer have a free plan. So you have to pay to use Heroku in the way that we use it with Vapor. But the nice thing is we do not have API call limits, whereas on both of the other ones, we do. But instead, we pay for more of what's called the environment. So we're paying for things like uptime. How much guaranteed uptime do we have? What kind of logging do we want to have? And those are the ways that you pay for Vapor versus on the other two, it's more of how you're actually using it. So what kind of data do we want to use? It goes back to our question, thinking about do we want to use SQL or NoSQL? And the options that we have with Firebase are the Firestore and real-time database, and they're actually different. The real-time database was the first one that Firebase had, and it is just your basic JSON data, whereas Firestore uses documents to store everything. And reference Navati, or stock that she had, she tells you all about Firestore and how to actually use it, whereas I won't really tell you. And then lastly, there's Firebase storage. So this is where you're actually going to end up storing your pictures and files, whereas using real-time and Firestore, you're kind of mainly storing text for everything. With Amplify, you can use DynamoDB, which is their key value database, and they have Amplify Storage, which uses the backend service called S3 for their storage solution. And then again, with Vapor, you have the option to do whichever database you want out of these 4 at the moment, but Vapor is an open source project, so you can actually submit an issue if you wanted to start adding more things like SQL Server and seeing that kind of interfacing. Then we have authentication. So we have a couple options. They sound basic, but we have social login, and then with Vapor, you can use basic and bearer. But they all have social logins between all 3 of them. It just depends on which one you want to use. So like Firebase, you can use GitHub and Microsoft to log in, whereas with AWS Amplify, you can only use Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. You literally have no other options. But then with Vapor, you can't use it inherently with social logins, but you can use a third-party package that is called Imperial to actually start integrating things like Shopify or Discord. These are the considerations that we have: pricing, data, and authentication. If you couldn't figure out what you want to do with that, we're still wondering what the question is, though. Which one do we use? And it still depends, because while those are the basic considerations we have, there's a couple different scenarios that you want to think about as well. But also when thinking about the scenarios, you have to think about yourself. You're the indie iOS dev that's making this application. You want to think about how much time do I want to spend? Do I want to spend all the time making an API using Vapor when I have no idea how to make an API and what a database is? It's probably not going to be your best option. Whereas you can also think about maintenance. We're iOS devs. I don't really want to spend all my time making sure my database is up and running and what goes into that So because of that, that may change your decision on which one you want to use. So a couple scenarios we have are fastest to market. For this, I would choose either Firebase or Amplify because they have built-in APIs for us to use to immediately write and read data from the database. and they have authentication built in. Whereas your other choice, like Vapor, is going to be your most custom because you can choose, and literally everything that you want to do with it, you can figure out how to do. But depending on how much backend knowledge you have, that may take a longer time than implementing the other ones. Thinking about maintenance, we have Firebase and Amplify because, again, how often do you want to be thinking about your backend? Do you want it to just run, or do you really want to know like the details of when something goes wrong, I want to be able to trace exactly where it went with your solution like with Vapor. And then we have lowest cost. As indie devs, I want to try to do everything for free. That's usually the easiest to get started. So really, you can go with any of them. Heroku now costs money, but they have a bunch of other options for deployment, like DigitalOcean, Nginx, Supervisor, Docker, a bunch of other ways to deploy. And again, database complexity. So think about what does the data look like that you're going to be saving? How are you presenting that data? Depending on which one you want to do, you can choose whichever one you want because, again, it doesn't really matter which one you choose in the end, you're probably going to change it because database migrations are something that's pretty common. It's okay to just move your data around or end up switching everything over because it's a problem we've been facing for the last 50 years. Like we've all run into it before. And then with social logins, you could choose Firebase and Amplify mainly because they have a drop-in UI. So really, they already have the UI built for you or like a single button built in. All you have to do is use that button, call the callback, and then everything works. Whereas Vapor, you have to build all of that yourself. And I think authentication can be one of the hardest parts because somebody will try to do something malicious at some point. So having something that's already pre-built and already knows those kind of limitations, this would be the easiest one to get started with. But the question still remains, for an indie dev, which one is the best? And right now, my current choice is Firebase because AWS's pricing is pretty confusing. Like I said, if you go onto their website and try to find just AWS Amplify pricing, it doesn't really tell you. It's super flexible because it gives you the option to use a lot of different things. But if you're trying to just get up and running, you don't want to spend way too much time on the database, Firebase is the easiest choice, I think. But then with Vapor, you have to have a lot more backend knowledge to get started. So you have to think about like, what does my database look like? How do I want to connect to it? How do I even design the API? Which honestly, I don't really know. It's you kind of just figure it out as you go. But it depends on which one you really want to do, how much time you have, and what you want to do for your backend, for your indie iOS app, all the different considerations for the scenarios that we have. But remember, in the end though, it doesn't really matter. Like Justin said, all of the code is ephemeral, so you can choose whichever one you want, and you're probably going to change it later, like everyone else is. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
For that, question is about authentication and logging. When you log in, are there differences between these three options on who you log in as? Maybe for my app, I don't want to log in as the customer, but I want to log in as my account. That it's my service, regardless of who the actual user on the phone is. So can you do some? Is there a difference between the server between those three options for that?
So your question is like, is there a difference between when I log in, not logging in as myself, but in what way?
Not logging in as the customer, but logging in
like as an admin?
So that
Yeah.
let's say I'm saving my credentials on the phone so that I have just one connection and one account to log in. Can that be done with these servers?
Okay, so yeah, the question is, when you log in, can you log in sort of as like a dev admin super user as opposed to like a basic customer? Okay, yeah, you can definitely do that with all three of them. It's really about how you, again, depending on how you set up your database. So like if you have certain permissions, only some people can access some data, you would make it so that you as the developer, super user, have access to all of those different things. Like for example, you give admins or maintainers roles to be able to do something versus customers don't have those roles and they're labeled as a customer. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
What about privacy considerations between them? I assume that there's a library that you can put into your app policies regarding what data of your user might go to a third party and how that might impact what you have to put in privacy report in the App Store, or just risking your user's data?
Yeah, so the question is about privacy within all three of these. So I know for a fact when I was looking through privacy for Heroku, they have a very specific, what is the name of that, like, super health privacy? HIPAA, that's what it is. They have a specific tier for that, where like if you need to be HIPAA compliant, you get to pay this lovely tier, versus if you don't have that, you don't have to pay that amount. But then that's specific to Heroku, whereas the other ones, I believe it's most likely in the privacy policy for each of those, because yeah, Firebase shares all your data, Amazon also shares your data, so it's more of like knowing the backend for which ones they share with, which I think almost all of them have a very specific, like iOS 13, what is that? The like nutrition menu of privacy of all that. They all have like things related to that, because both of them were like, oh shit, we have to tell you now. So yeah, they both have those listed, but specific to privacy within your app of like maintainers want a certain kind of level of access versus like your basic customers or something, that would be something that you would build into your database when you're actually designing it. Yeah.
AWS and Firebase both have
Okay, yeah, thank you. So we mentioned that HIPAA is compliant for both AWS and Firebase. Great. Anything else? Anything on Slack, Bowie? Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you're talking about, the question is how you decide what your schema is going to look like, pretty much? Mm-hmm. Okay, so question is more of like the schema and evolving it naturally, or kind of sketching it all out from the beginning. I would say personally, my background is with SQL databases, so I just always default to immediately thinking of everything in tables, because I'm like, okay, we have a customers table, we have an orders table, we have a products table. Those are super basic because those are like immediate examples every website will ever give you. But I always think of everything immediately with SQL, and then to try to convert that to NoSQL. Firebase actually has a specific YouTube playlist that says like Firebase for SQL developers, because they show you what the tables would look like and then how you would take that data and organize it in a NoSQL database. Because in the end, they can accomplish the same thing. It depends on how sort of heavy those relationships are between things for which one I kind of decide to go with. A lot of my own apps, I'll end up using Firebase because it's super easy to get up and running. But then I think of them as tables and then figure out how that would look like in NoSQL. Whereas when right now I'm building an expense tracker app, I used Postgres for that, and I think of everything in tables and kind of just go with that using primary keys, foreign keys, and that kind of thing. So I think of it immediately from the beginning, and then it can evolve as you go, because when you can add rows to like SQL databases, like despite what people say, like it's definitely possible. It's more of how restrictive do you kind of make your rules to begin with when you know maybe this isn't fully what it's going to end up being, or just set everything as null or backfill everything as well. So it gives you a lot of different options of what you can do, because really they both go back and forth pretty easily. Like unless you're really thinking of you're about to have like 1 million users immediately, you don't need to think about it too hard. Any other questions? Slack has any? Yeah.
Okay, so this is probably really a beginner question, but how do you know that you should be using one of these instead of using core data?
So this is, yeah, I focused mainly on cloud databases because a lot of apps and like your customers will think of, oh yeah, sorry, the question too was, how do we know if we want to use cloud databases versus like local databases? And I think of it as almost all users kind of expect, if you know your app is going to be iPhone and iPad, you're most likely going to want to use a cloud database so you can sync the data between the two. Whereas if you're building a straight up like iPhone app, not connecting to anything else, you could possibly just end up using a local database because we're not going to be syncing data between things, and also depending on if you want to have offline support. So how much of your app do you want to be usable, not connected to the internet? Yep. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much, and thank you.